Welcome to the Potting Up tutorial by the SER-UW Nursery, where we'll focus on potting up bare root plants specifically. Please feel free to follow up for any additional information by emailing us at sernursery@gmail.com or check out what we're doing on Instagram at SER-Nursery. Let's get started. Welcome to the SER-UW Nursery Hoop House. As you can see in this picture, there are plants in 1 gallon sized pots, which is what we will be using today in our bare root plants. But there are several different sizes to consider for different plants. Here's an example of using different sized pots. This is the tall 1 gallon pot that we used for Gary Oaks or Quaker Scariana. Gary Oaks have a deep and vertical root system, so we want to make sure that they have a tall pot to grow down. This is Camassia quamish, or common camas, in a D16 cone. It's called a D16 cone because this cone is 16 cubic inches. We keep camas in cones rather than a pot because the plant has a bulb and vertical grass-like shoots as leaves and doesn't grow much taller than a foot tall. One last example is our field chickweed, or Cerastium arvens, in our 4-inch pots. The 4-inch pots come in pretty handy for common understory plants or prairie plants such as the field chickweed. Right outside our nursery, here we have our clean pot rack where we keep all of our assortment of pots, including pots, trays, and cones. And on the back side of the nursery is our dirty pot rack, which is where after we've up-potted things or sold things, we'll put the dirty pots there and eventually wash them and bring them back to the clean pot rack. Pots were the first thing we needed, as you can imagine, when we're potting up plants, and I'm sure you can guess that the second thing that we need is soil or media. The media that we use in our standard potting mix is 10 parts fine bark mulch, which is on the right, and 1 part compost on the left. The compost is from Seattle Grow Co. Or King County Grow Co., and it's actually a biosolid program composting. So it's local and provides the nutrients that our plants need. The fine bark mulch, I believe, is a byproduct of the timber industry and is mostly fir and hemlock. So we scoop the fine bark mulch into the wheelbarrow, and then after that we do a top layer of the compost. And you may be able to tell in the picture that the compost has a much different texture than the fine bark mulch, and we really want to homogenize that, but it can be hard to do in this small space. So we dump it into this basin that we're going to be using anyway when we're potting up, just because it's easier to work with a larger space, especially when we have several volunteers or nursery team members in potting things, but today it's just me. So we dump it into this basin and really mix things around to make sure that all the texture and nutrients and material are homogenized. And the next thing we need to pot up our bare root plants would, of course, be our bare root plants. To get our bare roots, we've been storing them in a sawdust bed, and when we bring them into the nursery, we want to make sure that the roots are not as exposed to the elements and dry out, but rather they stay in some moist sawdust. So here is a bucket of some sawdust that we've been saving, and what we've been doing is just dumping it in another wheelbarrow to bury the roots of the bare root plants that we bring in before we pot them up. And here's another component of the nursery other than the hoop house. Here we have our 4 wet beds and our 3 sawdust beds. The sawdust bed with the black shade cloth in the back is where we've been keeping our bare root plants. And we keep our bare root plants in the sawdust bed under the shade because the sawdust helps retain moisture and they're super easy to pull out. And the shade protects the plants that are pretty vulnerable right now because they're not in soil, they don't have access to nutrients. The shade cloth protects them from sun and keeps them from growing their leaves too much. We don't want our plants to be focusing on photosynthesizing and growing, but rather just staying alive. Okay, hopefully this is the worst quality video that I've taken, but I took it just to show how we keep our plants hidden in the shade cloth. We have, one layer that kind of overlaps, so maybe 1.5 in some areas, but we keep it down to also try to bunny proof it along with the fence that we have surrounding the plants. Bunnies definitely love the new growth of plants during the spring, and we want to make sure we keep them out. So as you can see that the plants, they really easily just pull out of the sawdust. And here's just a more clear picture of our plants in the sawdust wheelbarrow that we'll transport to the hoop house before we pot them up, just in case the video wasn't clear enough. And here's a final material setup that we need to pot up all our plants. We have our bare roots, of course, and not the sawdust to stay moist while we're doing one plant at a time. We have a nursery cart that will come in handy when we put all the finished potted up plants onto the cart, so we can easily move them around to the watering station and to the different benches around the hoop house. We have our 1-gallon pots that we'll need, of course, and we have an Osmocote, which is a topical slow-release fertilizer that we put just a little scoop of on each plant. And then, of course, our potting media in the basin. Here's a close-up of the Osmocote that I briefly mentioned, the slow-release topical fertilizer. It's slow-release because we only need to do 1/4 of a teaspoon on the top of a 1-gallon plant. That's good for up to 6 months or so. And this Osmocote contains, I think it's 11 of the essential plant nutrients, which mostly includes nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Okay, now to begin with the actual potting up. Usually we do this potting on the potting bench in the hoop house, but this is a very heavy bin of media that I can't quite move myself, so we're on the ground today. So a lot of plants will have developed root structures like the one about to be shown here. And those root structures kind of have two main parts or halves that can be pulled apart or separated. And we want to make sure that they're on opposite sides or as evenly distributed in the pot as possible so the roots can form a strong structure while minimizing the circling of roots around the pot. And we can do this by making a mountain shape in the pot by forming the media into a mound, and then we drape the roots over either side. Then we hold the plant steady while we fill the rest of the pot. And in this video, it looks like I'm compacting the soil, but know that I'm not actually pressing it down too much. I just want to make sure that all the roots are under media. And that's about it. We have one Indian plum bare root plant that is now potted in a standard 1-gallon. And here are just close-up pictures of what I mean with the separated roots and how you can separate those onto two different sides and make a mound shape in the media, and then you drape the roots over either side. And these pictures are to answer a question about what happens if the roots aren't forming in those kind of two parallel root sections. And at that point, it's kind of up to the potter's discretion how best to pot the kind of one downward root. But in this example, instead of making the mound in the soil or the media, I just made a deeper hole and then put the whole root into that. And I think this individual plant will have enough lateral roots on the main root that it can spread out around the pot just fine. Okay, and these are our last few steps of potting up. We have all our plants loaded onto the nursery cart so we can move them around pretty readily. And then we make name tags for all the plants, and we usually do about 1 tag per every 4 or 5 plants for the gallon size. These tags have a 4-letter code that corresponds to the botanical or Latin name of the plant. So this plant, for instance, is common snowberry, and that's known as Symphoricarpus albus. So we use the first 2 letters of the genus, SY, and the first 2 letters of the species name, AL, to make Cial. And then on the back side, we have BR for bare root and the date in which we potted it up. Next, we have our slow-release fertilizer, our Osmocote, and that contains nutrients required for plant growth like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we do a 1/4 teaspoon per every 1-gallon pot. and that will be good for up to 6 months since it's slow release, and we don't have to worry about fertilizing them after this. And so lastly, we water our plants in. We want to fully saturate all the plants with water, and this is to make sure that that we compact the soil down so there aren't any more gaping air bubbles of media in the pot. And that's that for potting up bare root plants into 1 gallon pots. Thanks for watching.